Okay, so you're buying a new telescope, whether it's like a Newtonian with a coma corrector or something like that, a little refractor, whatever. And in the specs somewhere, you'll often see something called back focus. Like, the back focus needs to be 55 millimeters. Sometimes it's more. With some telescopes, with some focal reducers, it's like 105 millimeters. And for some, it's like between 50 and 60 millimeters. That's the case of this guy here. And for some others, it doesn't seem to matter. So exactly what is going on here? What is back focus? And how should you read those numbers there? So it's very easy with back focus to get a bit pedantic about the definition of back focus, when we should be using the term back focus versus the term like just focus point, that kind of stuff. I'll try to give a simple understanding of what that is. Basically, when you see a back focus requirement on a telescope, let's say you see on a telescope the back focus requirement is 55 millimeters, it just means that between a certain point in the imaging train and your camera sensor, there should be roughly 55 millimeters of optical distance. So for instance, if you look at this telescope behind me, I have fitted within this telescope something called a coma corrector / focal reducer that makes me have like nice round stars throughout the field of view of my camera, which I would not be getting without that optical element. And there's a requirement that says that between that optical element, and actually it's between the flange of that optical element, I'll get back to that in a moment, but between that optical element and the sensor that's in the camera, we need to have exactly 55 millimeters of optical distance. So let me quickly remove the entire little optical assembly here, just so that we can have a closer look. Okay, so what do we have here? We have a filter wheel, okay, with filters inside. We have this thing here, I'll get back to it in a moment. We have an off-axis guider, and then we have the camera here at the end. So I'm going to remove that long thing at the front, and this is what we see. This is a coma corrector, and also it happens to be a focal reducer. So it widens the field of view of my telescope by reducing the focal length. Okay, and as you may see, there is a lens inside, right? Things are a bit weird if we look inside of that coma corrector. So there is a lens, and that lens within this little thing here has some sort of native focal length, meaning that between the lens that's inside this tube and between the camera sensor, which we can see at the very end of the light path, we need to have, in this case, a certain optical distance. What exactly that optical distance is, I'm not actually sure, because the requirements have been measured from the flange of that element here. And the flange is that flat part here. So what we're saying in terms of the requirement with this telescope, which for astrophotography really needs to be used with this coma corrector, in fact it comes with this coma corrector, we need to have the distance between the coma corrector and my camera sensor here of 55 millimeters. That's really the gist of back focus, exactly what it means when you have a back focus requirement. Now, let's assume that I didn't have this, right? I don't have this at all, and I'm just connecting directly my camera via some kind of adapter. I have it connected directly to the telescope without this coma corrector in the light path. What happens then? What should be my back focus? Well, the answer to that is that it kind of doesn't matter as long as you reach focus. And getting in the focus really means being at a set distance between the primary mirror. This is a Newtonian telescope. It has a primary mirror here that catches all of the light falling into the tube and focuses it. This particular primary mirror has a focal length of 600 millimeters, which means that to be in focus, my camera sensor needs to be placed 600 millimeters away from the primary mirror that's within the telescope. And so if I connect it directly like that to the optical assembly, my only requirement is that I can rack in or out the focuser tube that we see here with the focusing knob enough so I can reach focus. So for instance, if I had like a really long distance, if I had like put a huge long tube with no optics or anything like that, but a huge long tube so that my camera was something like here in comparison to the focuser, then maybe I would never be able to reach focus, right? So even when you don't have any weird optical element at the end, you could kind of say that there are back focus limitations in that, and it's taking more of a like liberal definition of the term back focus, you just need to be within a certain range of distances between the flange of your focuser, for instance, and your camera sensor at the end. And this is just so that at some setting of this tube being racked in and out via the focuser, you'll be able to have exactly 600 millimeters between the camera sensor and the mirror, and therefore you will be in focus. But in that case, the actual specific distance between the flange here and my camera sensor doesn't really matter, again, as long as we can reach focus. So exactly what changes when we have this kind of optical element here, it just means that now, because this optical element I added here has its own kind of native focal length, I need to have whatever required back focus distance between the optical element and the camera sensor. For me, it's between the flange and the camera sensor. It should be 55 millimeters. And then, to achieve focus, I just need to be able to rake in the whole assembly with the 55 millimeters being fixed between the coma corrector and the camera sensor. But just I need to be able to achieve focus, and that means that the lens assembly in there needs to be like at some distance from the primary mirror. We just need to be in such a way that via the focuser mechanism, I'm able to achieve focus, which is actually always the case with a focal reducer that is provided with a telescope, assuming that you've basically followed the back focus requirement. So that should never be an issue. Okay, so you can see exactly what the back focus is. When you see a back focus requirement, it's a back focus requirement between something and your camera sensor. It's a certain specific distance between something and a camera sensor. And most of the time, it's between the flange of some optical element, typically the last element in your optical train, so you can very easily see where the flange is, and your camera sensor. So it's very easy to know exactly how you're going to be accomplishing that back focus. Sometimes, though, it is not quoted in that way, so you need to be careful. The back focus, if you have a telescope that's called the Celestron Edge HD 8, which is an 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain type of telescope, and you use it with the f7 focal reducer, the back focus distance for that particular setup is said to be 105 millimeters, but it is not from the flange of the focal reducer, it is actually from the top of the threads of the focal reducers, which makes to me no sense at all, because it's much more difficult for us to measure a distance between the top of the threads to a camera sensor than it is between the focuser flange to the camera sensor. Because those threads there, this maybe 3-4 millimeters long threads, they just disappear within my off-axis guider, so they don't really affect the length of the back focus distance between this and the camera sensor. So you need to be careful. Sometimes that back focus distance is quoted by the manufacturer in a weird way, and that Edge HD focal reducer is one of those weird ways. Now, if we look at some other types of telescopes, this thing is a refractor, but it has something that is called a Petzval design. And again, you can be very pedantic about exactly what a Petzval design is. I tend, somewhat incorrectly, to just say that it is a telescope design where if you're able to achieve focus, then your back focus distance is correct. It's basically something similar as this telescope when I'm not using this coma corrector at the end. So for this particular telescope here, the way that it works is that it has like all sorts of optical elements within this telescope, and our only requirement is that between the flange of the telescope, which is just there, and the camera sensor, which is within this camera body here, we have a distance between 50 millimeters and 60 millimeters. And this is effectively because the focuser travel within the telescope can move only up to 1 centimeter, physically speaking. And so it's something very similar to this in a way when you don't have the coma corrector. So that's one of the advantages of a Petzval design. You don't need to care that much about back focus. Okay, so now how do you achieve the required distance of back focus, which is usually 55 millimeters? It's actually usually fairly easy. If you have a DSLR, you can buy an accessory called a T-ring specifically for your DSLR. And the T-ring is actually built so that once you attach it to the telescope and to your camera, the camera sensor will be at 55 millimeters from the telescope flange. Easy, you're done. What if you've bought an astrophotography camera? Well, these days, they come with accessories, like these accessories here with this camera, which is the 2600 MC Air camera from ZW, where you can see that each accessory has a measurement on the side. This one is 21 millimeters thick, that one is 16.5 millimeters thick, and something we, as if you're a beginner, we tend to forget. There is an actual distance between the flange of the camera itself and the sensor that is within the body. And if you've ever used a DSLR, you may have noticed that there's some kind of weird little circle with a line in the middle somewhere on your camera body. It's not here, but if you have a DSLR, you might have noticed that. And that tells you actually where the focal plane of your sensor actually is. We don't get that because on this kind of astrophotography camera, because we are given a measurement that between the flange here and the camera sensor, there is exactly 17.5 millimeters. So what happens if you add 17.5 for the distance between the camera flange and the camera sensor, plus 16.5 plus 21, you get 55. So we get our 55 millimeters of back focus, and we're done. And even with accessories, it can actually be very easy because a lot of manufacturers have put a lot of thought in making it easy for us to achieve those usually 55 millimeters of back focus. So for instance, here we have my main camera, which also happens to have a flange to sensor distance of 17.5 millimeters. This is, by the way, the ATR 585 monochrome camera by Toptech, which I've reviewed on the channel recently. It's a really nice setup. And we have a filter wheel there. And guess what? That filter wheel is actually 21 millimeters thick. Reminds me of this first ring adapter here, which is also 21 millimeters thick. And then we have the off-axis guider. And what would you know? The off-axis guider thickness is 16.5 millimeters. So wait a second, we get 17.5, we get 16.5, we get 21, we have 55 millimeters of back focus. We're good, except we're not, because there are filters inside, and filters have an impact on your optical back focus distance, but I will get back to that in a moment because I want to show you a third example, which is this one here, where we have also an off-axis guider, but we also have a filter drawer rather than a filter wheel, and then a camera, which this one is what? Oh yeah, this is the 585 color camera by Toptech. And here, what do we have? We have 17.5 between the camera flange and the sensor. We have this filter drawer, and what would you know? It is 21 millimeters thick. And then we have this off-axis guider from another brand, from ZW, together with the 220 mini guide camera there. And what would you know? It is 16.5 millimeters thick. So again, we are by default at 55 millimeters of back focus, except that I have a filter in the middle. And as I said earlier, that changes things a little bit. So that's for a few examples there, but I mentioned filters. What happens when you have filters? Well, going back to this, I have a coma corrector / focal reducer here at the very top, just like we had earlier with this telescope here. And I have my off-axis guider, and I have a filter here. What happens is that a filter, depending on its refractive index, which is basically a measurement of how fast light goes through the glass, but depending on its refractive index, it will actually reduce the optical distance that you have between your off-axis guider flange and your camera sensor, which is currently 55 millimeters, but the optical distance will be modified by roughly 1/3 of the physical thickness of the filter. So this filter, if we assume it is made of glass, which has a refractive index of 1.5, and we assume the glass itself is 2 millimeters thick, then my back focus distance, which is physically 55 millimeters, will actually be slightly shorter at 54.3 millimeters, because we have to subtract from it 1/3 of the thickness of this filter. And the thing is, though, the filters are not always a refractive index of 1.5. In fact, most narrowband filters are 1.8 or even 2 as a refractive index. And that you need for a narrowband filter typically to account for 1/2, based on my calculations at least, of the filter thickness. So it can vary a little bit. But because now my optical back focus distance between my coma corrector flange here and the camera sensor is only 54.3 millimeters instead of the 55 millimeters that are required, I would be supposed to add some distance, 0.7 millimeters to be precise, to have the right back focus distance. How would you accomplish that? Or how would you do adjustments of your back focus distance when you have to venture away from the realm of well-supported and well-measured adapters? Well, you can use adapters like those. So I have like 7 millimeter thickness stuff. We have 10 millimeters, 8 millimeters, 5 millimeters, etc. So I have tons of rings there that I can put in my light path to increase the back focus distance if necessary. And then I have rings like those, which you can put in between elements of your optical train, and that one is exactly 1 millimeter thick. But I have others. This one is 0.8 millimeters thick, and that one 0.5 millimeters thick. So fun stuff there. We could do a lot of things with those rings, but I will say, and this is probably blasphemy, and so you should not listen to me and what I'm about to say, but I have kind of adjusted back focus distance with a lot of equipment, from refractors to Newtonian with their coma correctors there. And even with APS-C size sensors, I haven't seen much of a difference. So I have never really cared about, the impact of filters on your back focus distance. But those filters, they do have some impacts on, not just the back focus distance, but also how much you need to move your focus point. That's one of the reasons. If you have like a 2 millimeters thick filter and you replace it by another filter that has a different refractive index but the same thickness, or a similar refractive index but a different thickness, then if you were in focus with the first filter, you may no longer be in focus with the second filter, and that's why you need to refocus between filters, or you need to set up filter offsets between filters, because you need to move this whole assembly back and forth with each of the filters. That can cause problem with the off-axis guiders, because you can really easily change the focus point of your off-axis guide camera without physically going to your rig. So it's a limitation of off-axis guiders. But that's the reason why you often need to refocus between filters. There's other reasons, like if your telescope does not focus all wavelengths at exactly the same place, which can happen with narrowband filters, where you could have exactly the same filter thickness and the same refractive index, but you still have to adjust the focus, and that is actually an issue with the telescope rather than the filter. But we're getting a bit off topic here. So also talking about like back focus distance and misadjustments of the back focus distance. Let's say you're at 53 millimeters rather than 55 millimeters, that kind of stuff. Well, it's supposed to be easy to tell whether you're at the right back focus distance or not. You're supposed to look at the stars that you get on your camera sensor when you've taken a picture. And if the stars at the edges of your camera sensor are looking like little comets that are all pointing towards the center, then it's either too close or too far. I never remember. I'll put like the chart next to me. And conversely, if instead of pointing straight to the center, they're actually at 90 degrees angle, so the stars are kind of looking at little comets like that in each of the corners, then you're either too close or too far. But again, I've actually never really observed that. Like, I've done small adjustments in back focus distance and not seen a difference whatsoever with a lot of different telescopes. I'm probably wrong. So don't listen to me. But yeah, I never really go too far into adjusting back focus because of that, because I've never really seen a difference with small changes of back focus. But that's just me. Don't listen to me. Okay, with that, I hope it helps, because back focus requirement in and of itself, it's not really complicated to understand. The real problem comes with achieving back focus. But we are very fortunate these days that for most cameras, when you purchase the camera, it comes with the right adapters. And we're also lucky that these days things have been standardized, like filter wheels. Usually they're 21 millimeters thick, so they add only 21 millimeters to the distance in your equipment. Filter drawers, I showed you one there, which is a ZW filter drawer, but then it's actually the same thing with this other filter drawer, which is by Tech. Those filter drawers they add also 21 millimeters of back focus. Off-axis guider, very often they are built, so they add just 16.5 millimeters of back focus. Things have been standardized. When I started astrophotography, it wasn't the case already, so that's why I bought like so many adapters all over the place, but I have not used those in years because I haven't had to. And if you buy one of those telescopes that have like a different back focus requirement, not 55 millimeters and not a range either, because this one is a range and 55 millimeters will work just fine. But if you buy, let's say, an Edge HD telescope with the focal reducer and you need those like 105 millimeters of back focus distance between the tip of the threads, not the flange, because I don't know why, but between the tip of the threads and your camera sensor of 105 millimeters. I do remember I had that in the past, that Celestron did provide basically all of the adapters you needed for that, including for DSLRs. And even if you use something like the Celestron off-axis guider, which is very thick, it takes much more than 16.5 millimeters of back focus, it's actually awesome. It's the best OAG I've ever used. But if you use that, it also comes with a lot of adapters to get exactly specific back focus distances. So things overall are much, much simpler these days than they used to be. And I'm really super thankful for that. So we are definitely making a lot of progress. And as I mentioned, your filter will impact your back focus distance. But to me, personally, I've never really seen an impact. I mean, I do try to adjust for the filter thickness, and I did a lot of tests with a lot of telescopes and didn't see much of a difference. But go down in the comments and we'll have a lot of people probably saying like, yeah, no, that's not right. You need to be very careful about that. I saw this with this telescope or that telescope, etc. And while you're going down there, please leave a comment. You also can leave a like. It really helps the channel out. And you can subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of video. If you want to support me more directly, and you're planning on buying anything from Amazon, Agena, High Point Scientific, First Light Optics, etc., if you do so, after clicking one of the links that I have down in the description, for example, any of the equipment that I have in this video, well, it will give me a small commission at no cost to you. And if you want to help me even more and you want to sponsor this channel directly, because yes, this video is sponsored, it is sponsored by my Patreon supporters and channel members. If you too want to support directly, you can become a channel member. It's the join button next to the subscribe button, or a Patreon member, and the link is down in the description. You guys, you know it. You make this possible. Thank you so much for your support. With that, I hope this was an interesting video and that you learned something. I hope I didn't say too much wrong things, but again, feel free to let us know down in the comments. As always, I would invite people to double check the comments because there's so many people helping each other in there. I love this community. But more important than all of that, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.